the day Chuck Norris died. What Dolph Lundgren whispered at the casket left everyone in tears. The church was small, plain, and quiet, in the way old churches usually are when the people inside know the loss is too heavy for noise. No cameras waited outside. No reporters stood by the doors. There were no flashing lights, no eager voices, no crowd trying to turn grief into spectacle. The men and women gathered there had come for one reason only. They had come to say goodbye to Chuck Norris. Dolph Lundgren sat in the last pew, shoulders squared, hands locked together so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. A man his size could never truly disappear, but he had still chosen the back row, as far from the casket as he could manage, without seeming disrespectful. He did not want the family to think he was hiding. He only wanted a little distance from the eyes of other people. At his age, and after all the years he had spent in front of cameras, he had learned there were some things a man should not perform for strangers. Grief was one of them. At the front of the room, the flowers around the casket were arranged with care, simple and steady, nothing too grand. It struck Dolph that Chuck would have liked that. Chuck had lived with a bigger reputation than most men could carry, yet the man himself had never seemed hungry for decoration. The loudest thing about him had always been what people said after he left the room. That was the part Dolph could not get out of his head now. Not the movies first. Not the fights. Not the lines. The jokes. All those years, people had laughed and passed around those stories online, those wild little pieces of nonsense that made Chuck sound less like a man and more like some force of nature. Chuck Norris does not lose. Chuck Norris does not age. Chuck Norris does not die. For a while, it had seemed harmless, even funny. The kind of joke that turned into a myth because the world needed myths. But sitting there in the hush of that church, with prayer drifting softly through the room and a casket at the front, Dolph felt the cruelty hidden inside the joke. The world had made Chuck too large to be human. Now human was exactly what he was. Dolph did not cry, not because he was cold and not because he felt less than the others did, but because the pain had settled too deep for tears to reach it yet. It sat low in his chest like a weight dropped down a well. He kept his eyes on the front, but his mind was already pulling away from the church, away from the flowers and the voices and the last clean shape of goodbye. In his memory, the air changed first. The church gave way to heat, dust, fake gun smoke, generator noise, shouted crew directions, boots grinding against gravel, old action stars carrying years in their knees and still trying not to show it. Bulgaria. The Expendables 2. That was where the memory always led. What had looked from the outside like just another big action picture, another round of guns, fists, and familiar faces, had not felt simple to Dolph when he was living it. For him, that set had become something else. A turning point. A place where a man could be surrounded by legends and still feel more alone than ever. Until one of those legends noticed, and Chuck had noticed. The set in Bulgaria had its own kind of weather, even when the forecast said the day would be clear. There was always dust hanging in the air, always the smell of fuel, hot lights, sweat, and burned powder from blank rounds. Men who had once ruled posters, VHS covers, and late-night cables stood around in tactical gear while crew members moved between them with clipboards, water bottles, and headsets. It was a strange thing to witness up close. Even for someone who belonged there, it felt less like making a movie and more like watching a room full of old war stories climb back into their boots. From the outside, Dolph fit the picture. He was still tall enough to turn heads before he spoke, still broad across the shoulders, still carrying that cold Scandinavian face audiences had remembered for decades. People on set greeted him with warmth. They knew his name. They knew his movies. They called him a legend because in that business, once enough years go by, the word gets handed around easily. But standing in the middle of those men, Dolph did not feel like a legend. He felt like a man who had shown up to a reunion he had not fully earned. That feeling did not come from one thing alone. It came from the slow wear of time, from careers rising and falling in public, from the quiet shame that can gather around a man before he notices how much space it has taken. By then, Dolph had already lived through enough to know that fame did not protect anybody from doubt. In some ways, it made the doubt worse. When things were going well, people called you iconic. When they were not, the same people talked as if you had somehow become smaller in plain sight. He had his own reasons for carrying that heaviness into Bulgaria. There had been ugly headlines, tabloid talk, stories told by people who knew little and assumed much. He had learned not to answer all of it, but that did not mean it left no mark. Bad press had a way of sticking to a man, especially when the man was already wondering whether his best years were behind him. The public saw a body that still looked strong and a name they recognized from old hits. What they did not see was the private fatigue of a man wondering whether recognition and relevance were the same thing. On that set, surrounded by Stallone, Statham, Van Damme, and the rest, Dolph could feel the comparison working on him all day long, even when nobody said a word. Sometimes, that was the worst part. Nobody had to be cruel. Nobody had to shut him out on purpose. The isolation came anyway. It was there in the little pauses when other men fell into easy circles built from longer friendships, bigger box office histories, or stronger positions in the culture. It was there in the way crews could drift toward the loudest gravitational pull on set. It was there in the old insecurity he hated admitting to himself. The one that whispered that he had always been almost there, almost as big, almost as central, almost as unforgettable, but not quite. A man could spend decades in the business and still be ambushed by the feeling of being the extra chair at the table. Dolph kept most of that to himself. He had too much pride to complain, and men of his generation were not raised to speak freely every time the ground inside them shifted. So he did what men like him usually do. He showed up on time. He hit his marks. He nodded when spoken to. He laughed when the room expected laughter. Then, he went quiet again. Chuck Norris arrived, carrying none of the noise a lesser man might have brought with him. He did not need an entry. By then his name had already outgrown ordinary celebrity and turned into something like folklore. Even people who had never watched his movies knew the outline of the myth. But on set, Chuck did not act like a myth. He acted like a man who had done this long enough to know that the calmest person in the room usually carried the most weight. In costume as Booker, the lone wolf. He looked exactly like the role required him to look. Steady, sharp, and dangerous, without seeming eager to prove any of it. When he stepped into a scene, the energy shifted, not because he made a show of himself, but because he did not. That kind of confidence was rare. It had age in it. It had faith in it. It had the settled feel of a man who no longer needed the room to crown him king. Dolph noticed that right away, and noticing it made him feel the distance between them more clearly. He would see Chuck standing quietly off to the side before a setup, not fidgeting, not chasing conversation, not checking whether people were watching. Crew members greeted him with respect that never felt forced. The younger actors looked at him the way younger fighters once looked at old champions. Even the jokes around Chuck worked differently. He had become the kind of man people built stories around because ordinary language no longer seemed enough. Dolph watched him from across the set and thought, that is a man the world decided to keep. He did not envy Chuck in a bitter way. It was not that simple. What he felt was more exhausting than jealousy. He felt worn down by comparison, by the silent measuring that happens inside a man when he stands near someone whose legend has settled deeper, cleaner, and more permanently into public memory. Dolph had fame, yes. He had success, yes. He had carved out a life most men could never touch. But standing among those figures in Bulgaria, with scandal still hanging around his name and time pressing harder on his back each year, he felt his confidence thinning by the hour. There were moments when the whole thing felt almost absurd to him. Here he was, a 6'5" action star with degrees, titles, a career that had crossed continents, and still he could feel like a boy standing at the edge of a gym, hoping the champions inside did not notice he was unsure of himself. He hated that feeling. He hated it because it made no sense from the outside, and because deep down he knew human beings are not built by logic alone. One afternoon, between setups, he stood off near a stack of equipment cases while the rest of the cast drifted through their own rhythms. Somebody was telling a story nearby, and the others were laughing. Dolph smiled on instinct, but he was not part of it. He stared out past the trailers toward the dry hills and felt that familiar empty pull again, the one that had been with him more and more lately. It was not only about career. It was not only about the press. It was the larger fear under all of it. The fear that maybe a man could spend his whole life building himself into something powerful and still end up uncertain of where he belonged. That was when he heard Chuck beside him. "Hot one," Chuck said. Dolph turned. "Yeah. Feels like the dust gets into everything." Chuck looked out the same way Dolph had been looking, as if the hills were worth considering. "It usually does." That might have been the end of it with someone else, just two men filling silence. But Chuck stayed there, not crowding him, not pushing him into conversation. He stood with the relaxed stillness of somebody who could wait all day for the truth to come to the surface on its own. After a few seconds, Chuck said, "You look tired." Dolph gave the sort of half-smile men use when they do not want to be read too clearly. "Long shoot." Chuck nodded once. That too. The words were simple, but there was something in the way he said them that made Dolph feel seen. And not in the public way he had spent years learning to distrust. Chuck was not looking at the actor, the body, the brand, or the old poster image. He was looking at the man underneath all that. And Dolph found that harder to handle than pity would have been. "I'm fine," he said, though even to his own ears it sounded worn out. Chuck did not challenge him. He just folded his arms and waited a beat before saying, "A lot of men say that right before they run themselves into the ground." Dolph let out a quiet breath through his nose. Not a laugh exactly, but close. "You always talk like that?" "Only when I think somebody needs it." That answer stayed with Dolph because there was no edge in it. No performance. Chuck was not trying to be wise. He was just being direct. And directness is hard to hide from when a man has spent too long hiding from himself. For the first time since arriving in Bulgaria, Dolph felt the wall inside him shift a little. Not fall, not break, but move. He looked down at the dirt near his boots and said, "It's strange. You spend years trying to make it, then one day you wake up and realize making it and keeping hold of yourself are two different jobs." Chuck turned his head and studied him, quiet and steady. "Yeah," he said. "They are." The crew called for places a moment later, and the conversation stopped there, unfinished on the surface. But something had already begun. Chuck had seen the silence in Dolph that others had walked past. He had caught the strain under the posture, the doubt beneath the professionalism. The loneliness a big set can hide if a man knows how to stand still. That was how it started, not with a grand speech, not with a dramatic confession, just with heat, dust, a pause between setups, and one older man recognizing that another man was carrying more than he could say. The next few hours passed the way long film days always do, with hurry on the surface and waiting underneath it. Marks were adjusted, cameras moved, people called for props, then called for quiet, then called for motion again. Dolph did what he had always done. He showed up where he was needed, gave the crew what they needed from him, and kept the rest of himself tucked away. From a distance, there was nothing unusual about him. He was professional, on time, steady in the frame, the same big presence people had paid to see for years. Still, something had shifted in him after that short exchange with Chuck. And the change unsettled him because it was small enough to deny and strong enough to feel. Late that afternoon, when the noise of the set had risen to its usual level and most people were focused on the next setup, Chuck glanced over at him and gave the slightest nod toward the far side of the lot. There was nothing dramatic in it, no secretive look, No air of importance, no gesture meant to draw attention. It was the kind of signal one man gives another when he does not want to make a show out of concern. Dolph hesitated for only a second, then followed. They walked past trailers, stacks of equipment, and a row of temporary fencing where the sounds of the production began to thin out. On the other side of a service truck, there was a patch of shade beside some cases and cables, plain and forgettable, the sort of place nobody would choose unless the point was to be left alone. Chuck stopped there and stood beside him, not facing him straight on, but looking out toward the edge of the property, where dry grass bent in the heat. That choice mattered more than Dolph would admit at the time. Chuck did not square up like a man about to deliver a lesson. He did not turn the moment into something formal. He just stood there with the easy stillness of someone who had spent a long life around strong men and knew that if you pushed too hard, they shut down. It let Dolph keep his dignity, and because it let him keep his dignity, it let him stay. For a little while, neither of them spoke. The noise from the set reached them in softened bursts, a shouted instruction here, a burst of laughter there, then the hum of machinery settling into the background. Dolph had spent years around public people, around men who filled silence because silence made them nervous, and it struck him that Chuck did not seem nervous at all. He looked like a man who had made peace with quiet a long time ago. Chuck finally said, "There comes a point where the spotlight stops helping you. And if you don't know who you are without it, that can scare the hell out of you." The words were so direct that Dolph almost looked at him in surprise. Not because the thought itself was new, but because he had heard very few people say it plainly. Most men in their business talked around weakness. They wrapped it in jokes, turned it into bravado, or hid it under stories about deals, workouts, and old wins. Chuck said it like he was discussing the weather, which somehow made it harder to dismiss. Dolph kept his eyes forward. "You saying that from experience?" Chuck gave a small breath that might have passed for a laugh in another man. "Everybody says these things from experience. Some just lie about it better." That stayed between them for a moment. Dolph could feel the old resistance rise in him, the part that did not want to be known too clearly, the part that would rather let people think he was distant than admit he was tired. He had lived too long inside an image to let go of it easily. Yet standing there with Chuck, he did not feel cornered. He felt invited, and that was different. Chuck went on in the same calm tone. He did not ask, "Are you okay?" And Dolph was grateful for that, because men like him had been answering that question falsely for most of their adult lives. Instead, Chuck talked about the years when success had looked solid from the outside and felt thin from the inside. About times when fame had done nothing for the emptiness waiting at home at the end of the day. He spoke about applause as if it were weather too. Useful in the moment, impossible to store, gone almost as soon as it arrived. He said there were seasons when a man could stand in front of a room full of people who admired him and still feel alone enough to hear the echo of his own doubts louder than their praise. He did not say these things with bitterness, and he did not say them like warnings meant to frighten a younger man. He said them with the steadiness of someone who had already passed through that country and was simply describing the road. There was no need in him to polish the truth. That was what Dolph noticed most. Chuck had reached an age where he no longer needed to protect the myth at every turn. He could speak as a man who had been admired, tested, worn down, built back up, and had nothing left to prove by pretending those rough years never happened. Dolph listened without interrupting. The longer Chuck spoke, the more Dolph felt a strange discomfort in his own chest. Not because he disagreed, but because so much of it landed where he had been hurting. There had been weeks, even months, when his own name had felt like something separate from him, a thing the public handled more freely than he did. He had watched headlines turn a complicated life into cheap summary, had felt the sting of scandal and the colder sting that followed it, the sense that people who once admired you were now measuring how far you had fallen. None of that was new in their world. Plenty of men had gone through it. What shook him was hearing another man put words to the private cost without making it sound pathetic or weak. Chuck looked over at him then, just once, and said, "You can't build a life on applause. It won't hold." Dolph nodded slowly. "I know that. Knowing it and living by it aren't always the same thing." That was the line that opened something. Dolph stared down at the dirt near his boots and took longer to answer than he usually would have. When he did speak, his voice came out lower, less guarded, as if some of the performance had slipped out of it without his permission. "There are days," he said, "when I don't know whether I'm tired from work, tired from people talking, or tired from trying to act like none of it gets to me." Chuck did not rush to comfort him. He let the sentence stay where it was, gave it room, then nodded once, the way a man nods when he recognizes truth, not just hears it. "That's because it does get to you," he said. "And pretending it doesn't only makes it heavier." Dolph gave a dry smile and shook his head a little. "You make it sound simple." "It isn't simple," Chuck said. "It's just plain." That plainness, more than anything else, was what Dolph trusted. There was no sermon in Chuck's voice, no effort to impress him with wisdom. When he began to speak about faith, he did it with that same grounded tone, not as a man trying to convert somebody in a moment of weakness, but as a man explaining what had kept him from getting swallowed by parts of life that could easily swallow anybody. He said that there came a time when a man could not lean on money, public image, or old victories to pull himself upright. Those things might dress a life up nicely, but they could not carry the weight of it. What held, he said, was discipline when nobody was clapping, gratitude when pride wanted to turn sour, honesty when excuses came easy, and a willingness to ask whether you were still living in a way you could respect when the room went quiet. He said faith mattered not because it made you untouchable, but because it gave you something deeper than opinion to stand on when your own mind was turning against you. "The trick isn't whether people still cheer for you," Chuck said. "The trick is whether you can still look at yourself straight when they don't." Dolph did not answer right away. He felt those words settle in him with the weight of something he had known in pieces, but never arranged that clearly. He was not a man who enjoyed exposing weakness, and he certainly was not one who liked being helped. Yet he could not deny that Chuck had come closer to naming his condition than anyone else had in years. Not by digging at him, not by asking him to confess, but by speaking around the truth until Dolph could hear his own life inside it. For the first time in a long while, he felt understood without being examined. That was a rare thing. Maybe the rarest. Most people either looked at him from far away and saw the old image, or they came too close too fast and asked for more than he wanted to give. Chuck did neither. He stood beside him like a man who knew that pride did not have to be broken to make room for honesty. After a long silence, Dolph said quietly, "I haven't been lost all at once. It's been slower than that." Chuck nodded. "That's how it usually goes." Dolph looked out toward the field, the light flattening toward evening now, and spoke a little more than he had intended. He admitted, without details, that the last stretch had worn him down, that the noise around his private life had gotten inside his head more than he liked, that being on a set filled with men who carried larger legends than his own had stirred up old doubts he thought he had outgrown. He did not make a speech of it. He said just enough for another man to understand. Chuck listened all the way through. When Dolph was done, Chuck said, "A man's rough season doesn't get the final word unless he lets it, but he does have to stop feeding it." That sentence settled over Dolph in a way the others had not. Not because it solved anything on the spot, but because it cut through the fog. He had, in fact, been feeding it with isolation, with comparison, with the habit of measuring his worth against louder names, cleaner reputations, bigger shadows. Hearing that laid out in plain terms did not fix the damage, but it did give him something solid to push against. A voice called for them from across the lot. They were needed back. Chuck pushed off the truck lightly, as if the conversation had been no more unusual than a coffee break. Before he stepped away, he said, You don't have to win every fight in one day. Just don't hand the dark more room than it's earned." Then he started back toward the set. Dolph stood there a second longer before following him. He would think about that talk for years, though at the time he did not yet know how much it would matter. He only knew that the tightness in him had eased, not disappeared, but loosened enough for air to get in. Nothing changed all at once after that. Dolph did not wake the next morning as a new man, lighter and free of every doubt that had been dogging him. Life did not work that way, and at his age he would not have trusted any transformation that came too fast. What changed first was smaller and more believable. The noise in his head lost a little of its hold. In the days that followed, he found himself moving through the set with a steadier mind. The old thoughts still came, but they no longer swallowed the whole day. He was less likely to drift into those private loops where failure felt larger than fact, and he was less tempted to stand outside himself, measuring who mattered more in the eyes of the world. Chuck had not rescued him in the dramatic way movies like to rescue people. He had simply shifted the ground under Dolph's thinking, enough that the man could get his footing back on his own. That mattered. Dolph had never wanted saving in any public sense. He would have rejected that outright. But he did need an anchor, and Chuck, without ever claiming the role, had become one. On set, Dolph began watching Chuck differently. Before, he had seen the legend first, the famous name, the reputation that had hardened into folklore. Now he began to notice the discipline underneath it, the lived-in calm that did not come from being adored, but from having resisted being hollowed out by that adoration. Chuck still said very little. He still carried himself with the same contained assurance. To most people, he was exactly what he had always seemed. Solid, dangerous, and unbothered. But Dolph could now see the work inside that steadiness. A man does not stay whole through fame, age, and public myth by accident. He stays whole because he fights for it, often in ways nobody sees. That realization changed the scale of things for Dolph. It made him less interested in the outer shape of Chuck's success and more interested in the inner cost of it. He understood, maybe for the first time, that strength was not only what the audience saw on a screen. Strength was also what a man refused to surrender when the audience went home. The scenes Chuck shot as Booker, the lone wolf, started hitting Dolph in a different place because of that. On camera, Booker arrived when things had gone sideways, stepped into danger with that same plain certainty, handled what needed handling, and moved on without asking to be celebrated. The role was written as a legend's entrance, and the audience would surely read it that way. Yet, to Dolph, those scenes carried another meaning now. They looked less like fantasy and more like a clean summary of the kind of man Chuck was. Not because he was superhuman, but because he knew how to arrive without noise, act without vanity, and leave something better behind him than what he found. That was what Chuck had done for him. He had stepped in at the right moment, not with fanfare, not with a lecture, and not in a way anyone else around them would have noticed. Most people on that set would have said Chuck Norris showed up, shot his scenes, and carried himself like Chuck Norris. Dolph knew there had been more to it than that. Somewhere between the trailers and the dusty edge of that Bulgarian lot, Chuck had pulled him back from a darker state of mind than anybody else had recognized. Their connection did not turn into a loud friendship after that. They did not suddenly start spending every hour together or putting on some public display of closeness for the people around them. That would have felt false to both men. Their bond took shape in smaller ways, the kind that last because they are built on respect rather than performance. A quiet word here, a look of recognition there, a brief exchange before a setup, or a few extra minutes after one. Nothing large enough for headlines, but more than enough to matter. Sometimes it was as simple as Chuck passing by and asking, "You good?" in a tone that made the words mean what they were supposed to mean. Sometimes Dolph would answer, "Yeah," and this time, the answer would be closer to true. Sometimes Chuck would say nothing at all, only give him that steady glance that seemed to remind him, without spelling it out. That a man could hold his ground if he chose to. Dolph came to value those moments more than he said. What Chuck offered him was not comfort in the soft sense. It was steadiness. It was example. It was the presence of an older man who had been through his share of pressure and disillusionment and had not let the whole machine turn him into something cheap. For a man like Dolph, that meant more than sympathy ever could. By the time the Bulgaria shoot neared its end, the shape of Chuck in Dolph's mind had changed for good. He was no longer just a martial arts icon, no longer only a movie star whose name had become a running joke and a public myth. He was a man who had spent years protecting something inside himself that mattered more than public opinion. And because he had protected that part, he had been able to hand some of that strength to somebody else without even making a point of it. Dolph understood then, though maybe not in full words, that real power had very little to do with the fist the camera loved. Real power was being able to keep from going sour. It was being able to walk through fame without letting fame eat your center. It was being able to see another man's struggle and step toward it quietly without needing credit. That was the bond that formed between them. Not flashy, not public, and not easy for outsiders to measure. It was built from one short talk that carried far beyond its length, and from the kind of gratitude a man does not always know how to speak aloud while the moment is still happening. For Dolph, Chuck became more than a colleague from one picture. He became a guidepost, a reminder that the strongest men were not always the loudest, and that the hardest fight a man ever wins may be the one that keeps him from losing himself. Years went by the way they always do in that line of work, with long stretches that looked ordinary from the outside and felt heavier from the inside. Projects came and went. Phone calls were returned or not returned. Names rose, faded, came back around, and faded again. Dolph kept working, kept moving, kept doing what men like him had always done when life got complicated. He stayed busy. He stayed upright. He carried his age the same way he carried most things, without much public complaint, even as it settled deeper into his joints and into his thinking. But the memory of Bulgaria never really left him. It stayed in him as one of those quiet landmarks a man does not talk about much. Not because it means little, but because it means too much to hand around loosely. Now and then he would remember the dust on that set, the dry heat, the smell of fuel and fake gun smoke, and the sound of Chuck's voice cutting through his own private fog with a kind of steady plainness that had gotten rarer with every passing year. Dolph had met plenty of strong men in his life, plenty of famous men too, but only a handful had ever made him feel less alone without making him feel small. Chuck had done that. That was why the news hit him the way it did. It came on an ordinary day, which somehow made it worse. There was no warning in the air, no dramatic sense that the world had changed before the words reached him. One moment there was just the usual rhythm of a day moving forward, and the next there was a voice, a message, a sentence that landed too hard and too fast for his mind to take hold of it. Chuck was gone. For a second, Dolph honestly did not understand what he had heard. The words were clear enough, but they did not fit the shape of the man. His first feeling was not sadness. It was blankness, the kind that comes when the mind refuses entry to something too large. He sat down because his legs had already started making the choice for him. The room did not spin exactly, but it seemed to pull away from him, as if distance had opened up between him and everything he could see. He stared ahead and felt something close to shock move through him in slow waves. It was not clean or cinematic. It was ugly in the private way real shock often is. His mouth had gone dry. His chest felt tight and hollow at the same time. For one strange moment, he had the disorienting sense that a part of his own past had just been yanked loose. It was not only Chuck he had lost. It was some piece of that older world too, the world where men like them still stood for something solid in his mind, where even if time moved on and careers changed shape, a few figures still seemed fixed in place. He had known, of course, that no man lived outside the rules of the body. He was not childish about death. He was old enough to have buried people, old enough to have seen what time did, old enough to know that strong men broke and famous men aged, and even icons were only flesh in the end. Still, the news knocked the air out of him because Chuck had lived in a strange place in the public imagination. The world had joked him into something larger than life. People had spent years turning him into a punchline about invincibility, about not aging, about not losing, about not falling. Even when you knew better, some part of you got used to the shape of that myth. Dolph had never believed the myth, but he had known the man inside it, and that made the loss cut deeper. The public had seen Chuck as a monument. Dolph had seen something harder and more human than that. He had seen a man who got tired, a man who had spent real strength trying to live by what he believed, a man who did not talk big about values because he was too busy trying to hold on to them. That was what made the news hurt in a different register. This was not just the death of a celebrity. Not to Dolph. It was the end of a type of man he had come to admire more with age than he ever had when he was younger. He sat there a long time after the call, not moving much, not trusting himself to do anything useful. He tried once to stand and found that his balance was still off, not from illness, but from the force of the blow. It embarrassed him, even alone, the way grief can still embarrass men who were raised to treat it like something to swallow. He put a hand on the back of a chair and stayed there until the weakness passed. When it did not leave strength behind. It left that same stunned emptiness, only now with pain beginning to push through it. The days that followed were blurred around the edges. Arrangements were made. Times were given. Messages came in from people who knew what Chuck meant to the culture, to movies, to a whole generation of men who had grown up on a certain kind of hero. Dolph answered when he had to. He thanked people when it was required. He did not linger in conversation. There was too much noise in the world already, and too much of what he felt did not belong inside casual talk. On the way to the funeral, he barely spoke. He rode in silence, looking out through the window while the landscape went by in broken pieces, never settling into anything he could hold. Memory moved the same way. Bulgaria came back in fragments. Chuck leaning against the side of that truck. Chuck saying, "You can't build a life on applause. It won't hold." Chuck looking at him with that plain, unforced steadiness that let a man feel recognized without feeling exposed. Each memory hurt now in a fresh way because it had been sealed shut. There would be no more unexpected calls, no chance encounter, no possibility that one day they might stand side by side again and pick up some small conversation where it had been left. That was what grief kept doing to him on the ride there. It did not come as one clean emotion. It kept changing shape. One minute he felt numb, and the next he felt something close to panic. Not loud panic, but a deep internal jolt, as if his system still had not accepted the fact of what had happened. More than once he closed his eyes and tried to steady his breathing, annoyed at himself for needing to. But the truth was simple. He was shaken in a way he had not expected to be. He felt almost physically struck by it. When he arrived at the church, he did not stop to talk more than necessary. He greeted who needed greeting, gave the brief, respectful nods a man gives in a room like that, and went inside. The stillness there hit him right away. It was private, restrained, and quiet in the exact way Chuck would have wanted, without spectacle and without all the usual machinery that can gather around a famous death. Dolph looked toward the front once, saw the casket, and felt the shock move through him all over again, this time lower and deeper. He did not go forward. Not then. Instead, he walked to the last pew and sat down, choosing the back without even thinking about it. He did not want to be the face people studied when they wanted proof that the loss mattered. He did not want anyone measuring his grief by the set of his mouth or the wetness in his eyes. Most of all, he did not want to share Chuck with the public version of Chuck just yet. He wanted to sit far away and remember him as a man he had known in one of his own dark seasons, not as a symbol the whole world believed it owned. So he sat in the last row, broad shoulders slightly bent, hands locked together again, and waited for the service to begin. The funeral unfolded with the same kind of restraint that had marked the church when Dolph first stepped inside. Nothing about it was loud. Nothing pushed for effect. The room was filled with the soft movements of people taking their seats, the low clearing of throats, the quiet rustle of clothing, and the sort of silence that only gathers when everyone present understands that words will be insufficient long before anyone speaks them. It suited Chuck. There was strength in the way the service was held, but no showmanship. That, Dolph thought, had always been one of the truest things about him. Even when the world insisted on making him larger than life, Chuck himself had carried a different kind of weight. He had presence, yes, and force, yes, but he had never seemed hungry for noise. Sitting in the back, Dolph felt that truth more sharply than ever. The whole thing was dignified, without trying to look dignified. That was close to the man. One by one, people stood to speak. They did not talk about him, as if he had been untouchable. They spoke of his principles, his steadiness, his sense of right and wrong, his refusal to bend just because the world found bending easier. Some talked about his discipline, others talked about his loyalty, his faith, or the way he could encourage a man without making a performance out of kindness. Nobody had to say much. In a room like that, even simple memories carried weight. With each story, Chuck's face became clearer in Dolph's mind, not dimmer. That was the strange cruelty of the service. Every kind word made the loss more specific. Grief is often abstract at first. It arrives as shock, as disbelief, as emptiness. But in that church, listening to people describe the shape of Chuck's character, Dolph felt the absence turning real. This was who had been lost. Not only the actor, not only the legend, but the man who had chosen how to live and paid the cost of that choice. As the service went on, another layer of memory kept pressing in. Dolph could not stop thinking about all those old jokes, the endless stream of online lines that had made Chuck into something close to supernatural. There had been a time when the whole world seemed happy to laugh at the idea that Chuck Norris could never be hurt, never be beaten, never even die. People had turned him into a folktale with boots on. For years, it had seemed harmless, maybe even affectionate, a strange modern form of admiration. Now, sitting in that church with a casket at the front, Dolph felt the bitter side of it. The man the world had made into a joke about invincibility was lying in silence like every other man eventually does. There was no kick through the lid, no wink at the camera, no return to the screen. Just flowers, prayer, and the final plain fact of the body's limit. And yet, as the thought moved through him, Dolph realized something that surprised him. Seeing Chuck like that did not make him smaller. It made him larger. The myth had always been too easy in some ways. It had stripped away the cost of being a man and replaced it with a cartoon version of strength. But the truth was harder, and, to Dolph, more worthy of respect. Chuck had not been great because he was untouched. He had been great because he was touched by the same wear, pressure, aging, and sorrow that touches every man. And he had still spent his life trying to hold the line on what he believed mattered. He had endured. He had carried responsibility. He had fought. Not to prove he was stronger than everyone else, but to remain answerable to his own conscience. That understanding settled over Dolph with a kind of painful clarity. Mortality had not reduced Chuck. It had revealed him. The body in the casket was finite, yes, but the life it had carried seemed more honorable now precisely because it had been finite and still used carefully. There was something almost unbearable in that. It made Chuck easier to touch in memory and harder to let go of. Dolph hardly moved through the service. He sat with his hands clasped, his back straight more from habit than comfort, and let the church, the past, and the present begin to overlap. Bulgaria kept slipping into the room. The dry air of the set met the cooler stillness of the sanctuary. The soft murmur of prayers crossed over old crew calls and the distant pop of blanks from scenes long finished. Above all, Chuck's voice came back to him in pieces, low and plain, saying things Dolph had not fully understood at the time and could never forget now. You can't build a life on applause. The trick is whether you can still look at yourself straight when they don't. Don't hand the dark more room than it's earned. Hearing those words in memory while the service continued in front of him brought a pressure to Dolph's chest that he could not ease. He swallowed hard once. Then again, he did not cry openly, but he was no longer as blank as he had been when the news first hit. The shock had begun to crack, and beneath it was grief in its real form. Not dramatic, not loud, but steady and punishing. By the time another speaker sat down and the church dipped again into silence, Dolph understood something he had not let himself fully face on the drive there. The most important thank you of his life had never actually been said. He had carried the gratitude for years. He had lived with it quietly, felt it whenever life pressed him toward bitterness or pride, and Chuck's words came back to steady him. But gratitude felt in silence is not the same as gratitude spoken, and now the man who had earned it sat at the front of the church beyond the reach of ordinary conversation. That realization did not make Dolph move. It only settled deeper inside him, where the pain had already made a home. He remained in the last pew, still as a carved figure, while the service went on around him, and understood that some debts of the heart are recognized too late for easy comfort. When the last speaker finished, the church did not break apart all at once. It loosened slowly, the way grief always does in a room full of grown people who have spent a lifetime learning how to hold themselves together. Chairs shifted. Shoes moved softly across the floor. A few people bowed their heads one more time before turning toward the aisle. Some paused near the front. Some touched the backs of pews as they passed, as if they needed the feel of wood under their hands to steady themselves before stepping back into the world outside. Dolph stayed where he was. He did not rise when others rose, and he did not look around to see who was leaving. He kept his eyes forward and let the room empty itself in layers, waiting for the last small noises to fall away. He needed that. He needed the air to clear of movement. Needed the last polite condolences and quiet footsteps to be gone before he stood in front of Chuck for the final time. There are moments a man can survive in public, and moments he can only bear in private. This was the second kind. So he remained in the last pew, still enough to look almost fixed in place, while the church grew wider around him. The silence changed as people left. It stopped being the silence of ceremony and became something more bare than that, something personal, something final. Only then did he move. He pushed himself up slowly, not because he was trying to make the moment larger than it was, but because his body had become heavy in a way that had little to do with age. Grief had weight. He felt it in his knees, in his chest, in the drag of each step as he started down the aisle. The distance from the back row to the casket was not far, yet it seemed to stretch in front of him as if memory itself had laid down between where he stood and where he had to go. With every step, Bulgaria came back, not as one clean scene, but in pieces. A patch of cold air on the set, early in the morning. Breath showing faintly before the day warmed up. Crew voices carrying across the lot. The metallic smell of equipment cases. The tired, restless energy of old action stars pretending they were not tired, pretending they were not carrying the wear of years in their backs, hips, shoulders, and Chuck in the middle of it, never loud, never trying to outshine the room, yet somehow impossible to miss. Dolph remembered the way Chuck had stood apart, without seeming distant. He remembered how strange that had felt at first, because so many famous men confuse quiet with importance and use silence as a tool to keep others below them. Chuck had never done that. His quiet made room. It did not close doors. That was why Dolph had followed him that day. That was why he had listened. Another step. He remembered the corner of the lot where Chuck had taken him, away from the traffic and the noise, where the world had narrowed to dust, shade, and the plain sound of one man telling the truth to another. Dolph had been near a breaking point then, though most people around him would never have guessed it. He had still been standing tall, still saying the right things, still wearing the face the public knew. But inside, he had been badly worn down by doubt, by scandal, by comparison, by that ugly private feeling that maybe the world had made its choice about who mattered most, and he had not made the final cut. Chuck had seen it anyway, not by forcing confession out of him, not by treating him like he was fragile. He had seen it because he knew what a man looks like when he is losing ground inside himself while doing everything he can to appear steady on the outside. And then he had done the rarest thing one man can do for another. He had stepped closer without crowding him. He had spoken plainly without humiliating him. He had offered something stronger than comfort. He had offered direction. By the time Dolph reached the front, his throat had tightened so much that swallowing hurt. The casket stood there in stillness, polished, solid, touched by the light that came through the church windows in a soft, late-day wash. For a moment he just stood over it and looked, his hands hanging at his sides, his face set in the rigid calm of a man who knows that if he gives himself too much room all at once, he may not hold. This was the point no memory could soften. This was the fact of it. The lone wolf had not ridden in to save anybody this time. The older man who had pulled him out of the dark was truly gone. Dolph lifted one hand and placed it on the wood. His palm was broad and heavy, and the contact was so simple it almost broke him. Not because the casket answered, and not because he believed anything dramatic would happen in that touch, but because the body remembers what the mind tries to resist. The grain of the wood under his hand made the loss real in a way no phone call, no service, no speech ever could. He left his hand there and bowed his head. And the years between Bulgaria and this church seemed to fold together until they were almost nothing. He did not cry out. He did not shake. He did not collapse in the way movies like to imagine grief. He only stood there with his hand resting on the casket and let the pain pass through him in long, quiet waves. In that stillness, all the public versions of Chuck began to fall away. The jokes, the legend, the exaggeration, the larger-than-life outline the world had drawn around him for so many years, none of it mattered now. What remained was the man Dolph had known, a man of faith, a man who had guarded his soul better than most, a man who had not looked away when another man was drifting. That was the Chuck who stood in front of Dolph, now in memory, more clearly than any film clip ever could. Not the icon, not the myth. The man. Dolph closed his eyes for a moment and felt the old words come back again. You can't build a life on applause. Don't hand the dark more room than it's earned. The trick is whether you can still look at yourself straight when they don't. He had carried those lines for years without telling Chuck how deeply they had stayed with him. He had let them work on him in private. He had leaned on them in bad seasons. He had used them to check himself when self-pity crept in, when bitterness whispered, when pride threatened to harden into something meaner than pride. Chuck had helped him more than he had ever said aloud. That was what made the grief so tender and so merciless at once. The man who had given him direction had done it without asking for any repayment, and now the only repayment left was this late, trembling gratitude spoken into silence. Dolph bent a little closer, lowered his head until his voice would not carry beyond the casket, and whispered, "Lone wolf. Time to rest now. Thank you for showing me the way." He stayed there after the words were spoken, because the words themselves did not release anything. They simply made the truth complete. That was his goodbye. Not polished, not clever, just honest. It held the film and the life around it. It held Booker and Chuck. It held the older man on that Bulgarian set and the friend who had changed the direction of another man's thinking without ever making a claim on him. There are people who pass through your life with noise, and there are people who leave marks so deep they go on shaping you long after the moment itself is over. Chuck had been that kind of man for Dolph. He had not stayed in his life every day. He had not needed to. What he gave had lasted. That was why the loss hurt the way it did. That was why the gratitude had weight. That was why a whisper in an empty church could carry more truth than all the applause either of them had ever heard. At last, Dolph straightened, though his hand remained on the wood a moment longer. Then he took it away carefully, as if he were setting down something fragile, and stood there looking at the casket one final time. His face had changed very little, but something in him had settled. The pain was still there. It would stay there, yet the words had been spoken, and that mattered. He turned at last and walked back up the aisle, slower than before, carrying the same grief and a different kind of peace. When Dolph stepped out of the church, the light outside looked almost wrong to him. The day had gone on as if nothing had happened. Trees moved in the wind. Cars sat in place. A few voices carried from farther off, muted by distance and by the condition of his own thoughts. It always feels strange, he thought, when the world keeps its balance on a day that has knocked yours loose. He paused on the steps for a moment before moving on. What he felt then was not dramatic, and it was not the kind of thing he would ever have put into a speech. It was quieter than that, and maybe stronger because it was quiet. He had the distinct sense that a chapter larger than either of their careers had closed inside that church. Not just the life of one man, and not just the memory of one film, but an entire way of standing in the world. Men like Chuck belonged to a generation that believed strength should serve something beyond itself. They were not perfect men. Dolph knew that better than most, but they had been formed by a set of ideas that asked a man to answer for his choices, to stay loyal, to keep his word, and to hold on to something decent, even when the world rewarded flash over substance. On the ride back, Dolph still said very little. He looked out the window again, as he had on the way there, but his thoughts had changed shape. He was no longer seeing Chuck as the figure the public had turned into legend. He was not seeing the memes, the jokes, the impossible image of a man too tough for time, too strong for sickness, too permanent for ordinary loss. That version had finally burned off in the quiet of the service and in the touch of his own hand against the casket. What remained now was simpler and far more lasting. He thought of Chuck as a man who had lived from the inside out, a man who had not let fame hollow him out, a man who had taken belief seriously enough to build a life around it, a man who had offered help without dressing it up as wisdom, a man who had seen another person slipping and stepped in before the fall got worse. That, Dolph realized, was the real legacy. Not the jokes about invincibility, not even the screen image. As powerful as that image had been, the real legacy was the effect a life could have on other lives when it was lived with consistency. Chuck had not needed to rescue the whole world to matter. He had mattered because he had been the right man at the right time for the people placed in front of him. In the days after the funeral, Dolph found that grief did not leave him in any neat order. Some mornings, it arrived as heaviness before he had fully opened his eyes. Some afternoons it came in through memory, through a phrase, a tone of voice, a look on somebody else's face that carried him back to Bulgaria before he had time to prepare for it. But even when the pain was sharp, it no longer came alone. Gratitude had started moving alongside it. That surprised him at first. He had expected grief to be darker, more punishing, more one-note than it was. Instead, it kept opening into memory, and memory kept leading him back not only to what had been lost, but to what had been given. The conversation on that set had not ended when the scene call pulled them apart. It had gone on for years inside him. He could see that now with embarrassing clarity. Chuck's words had worked their way into the structure of how he judged himself, how he measured success, how he checked his own pride when it started getting sour, how he stood back up when life made him feel foolish, smaller, or late to his own purpose. In that sense, Chuck had not stopped guiding him. He had only changed forms. He was no longer a man Dolph could call, no longer a presence in a room, no longer a voice that might speak across a set or from beside a truck in some forgotten corner of a working day. But he had become something else. Something grief cannot bury. He had become part of the inner voice that steadied Dolph when the old darkness tried to reopen. Not all of that voice belonged to Chuck, of course. A man still has to make his own choices. But some of the strength Dolph had used to keep from caving in over the years had first been handed to him in that plain conversation in Bulgaria, and that fact was now beyond argument. He found himself thinking differently about aging too. Before, age had often felt like subtraction, like the slow surrender of speed, certainty, spotlight, and ease. After the funeral, it seemed to him that age could also be refinement. If a man let it. Chuck had shown him that. The goal was not to stay untouchable. The goal was to stay intact. That thought stayed with him. So did the whisper he had finally spoken at the casket. He turned it over in his mind more than once, not because he regretted it, but because it had come out cleaner than most of the things he had said in public all his life. Lone wolf. Time to rest now. Thank you for showing me the way. It sounded simple, almost too simple for all it carried. Yet, that was probably why it was right. At the end of things, truth usually gets plainer, not fancier. Weeks later, and then longer after that, Dolph would still return to the same understanding. Loss had not erased what Chuck had done. If anything, it had made it easier to see the shape of it. Chuck had once pulled him away from a dark corner of himself, not with force, not with shame, but with steadiness. Now the only honorable response was to live in a way that proved the lesson had taken. No vow was spoken, no grand declaration was needed. That would have been wrong for both of them. The promise formed quietly instead, in the private part of Dolph that still knew how to listen. He would keep going. He would not let cynicism eat him alive. He would not hand bitterness more room than it had earned. He would remember that a man's real fight is often the one no audience sees. And that is where the story truly settled. Not in the church alone, not in the casket, not even in the whisper. It settled in the life of the man who walked away carrying sorrow in one hand and direction in the other. From then on, whenever Dolph felt the old weariness creep back in, whenever doubt started talking too loudly, whenever the world seemed determined to measure everything by fame, noise, and surface, he knew where his mind would go. Back to Bulgaria, back to that patch of shade beside the truck, back to the calm voice of an older man who had already learned what mattered and had cared enough to pass it on. Chuck was gone. That would remain painful for as long as Dolph had memory. But the way he had pointed still remained, and for the man left walking, that was enough to keep following. Before this story ends, I want to say one thing clearly and honestly. The story you've just listened to is fictional. The scenes, the conversations, the private moments, and the emotional details were created for storytelling. They were written to capture the kind of loyalty, gratitude, and quiet bond that can exist between men who share struggle, respect, and time. But the loss at the heart of this story is real. Chuck Norris has passed away. And for many people around the world, that news feels like the end of something much bigger than a career. He was not only a movie star, not only a martial artist, and not only a television legend. He was one of those rare figures who seemed larger than the screen, larger than the roles, and larger than the era that made him famous. For millions of fans, Chuck Norris represented strength, discipline, grit, and a kind of steady toughness that never needed to shout. That is why this story was written, not to claim something that happened exactly this way, and not to blur fiction with fact, but to honor the kind of impact Chuck Norris had on people. The details in this story were imagined, but the admiration behind them is not imagined at all. That admiration is real. The respect is real. The sadness is real. And I believe the feelings in this story are real too. Because when someone like Chuck Norris leaves this world, fans do not only remember the fight scenes, the action movies, or the famous one-liners. They remember how he made them feel. They remember what he stood for. They remember a time when strength looked different, when heroes felt steady, and when toughness was tied to character, not just image. That kind of legacy stays with people. So, While this story is fictional, it was written with genuine respect for Chuck Norris, for what he built, for what he represented, and for what he meant to generations of viewers who grew up watching him. And I also believe that the people who truly knew him, in ways the public never fully could, likely carry the same kind of love, respect, and sorrow that fans are feeling now, just in a more personal way. Rest in peace, Chuck Norris. Thank you for the films, the strength, the memories, and the example you left behind. And if Chuck Norris meant something to you too, leave a comment below. Tell me which movie, scene, or memory of his stayed with you the most. I'd love to read it.